I just click continue.
Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to the Sociology of Media Voices series. And today we have again a special, almost our guest expert in the area of media communications, and that is Dr. Jay Thompson. And he is a lecturer in professional communication in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University, where he is reaching ways of cultivating ethical online communication in an era of networked disinformation and digital hostility. Welcome again, Dr. J. Daniel Thompson.
And thank you very much for having me, Ricky and TASA.
Wow, love it. So let's start again. What is, and I guess just for our perhaps a new audience too, what does disinformation and digital hostility entail within the framework of communication?
They're excellent questions to start off with. I define disinformation as information that is verifiably incorrect and that is produced and distributed with the aim of doing harm. It could be doing harm to a particular social group, a way of life, a strand of faith, a political party, or a belief system. That is how I understand disinformation. Digital hostility is a great deal more subjective, referring as it does to communication that takes place online with that is generally incivil or uncivil, one of the two, and that is geared towards offending and or harming another individual, that does not respect things such as civility we've talked about, reciprocity, respect towards those with views very different to one's own. I consider disinformation to be a key example of digital hostility, even though, as we know, some of the forms that disinformation can look a long way from hostile.
Now, can I ask you, is this just a modern, like 21st century idea, or has there always been embedded within media platforms prior to the development and merging of digital platforms, misinformation and hostilities?
All right. Well, I just want to, if I'm allowed to
Yeah.
clarify something. You've used the term misinformation, which I would distinguish from
Oh,
disinformation.
okay,
No,
great.
no,
Because a
no.
lot of people would, yeah.
In terms of misinformation is information that's verifiably incorrect, but that is not necessarily spread with the aim of doing harm or with
Oh,
the aim of offending, although it might actually do both. And I would refer here to the many reports that have been released over time that the Queen of England has shuffled off her mortal coil. um, Most of these occasions, I would suggest that these are misinformation,
okay.
although they can certainly be distressing to a family.
Mm. And with disinformation, when did this sort of area of research become sort of prominent in the field of communication? What has there been a particular event that sort of precipitated this area of research?
All right. Well, communication scholars, sociologists, political scientists, internet researchers have long been fascinated with disinformation in its many and varied forms. It's an old field of study and certainly not one I'm going to take any credit for inaugurating. I would say based a lot of my research is on digital disinformation, which has obviously come about because of the spread of disinformation in online spaces. Earlier, I used the term network disinformation. As the sociologist Manuel Castells puts it, we live in a network society, a society joined up by myriad networks, including a whole maze of online networks through which material of all kinds can spread at a rate impossible in previous generations.
And
I mean, I'm not anti-internet, I'm not anti-Web 2.0, I'm not social media. What I simply want to point out is that for all the benefits of Web 2.0 or Web 3.0, I'm not quite sure what we're in at the moment, there are also very distinct drawbacks. And I'd say the spread, the ability to, and the technology through which to produce and disseminate disinformation are unprecedented, to use that term.
And what for me was fascinating was, I remember, I think we may have talked about this previously, but we could explore it again, with the onslaught with Trump and his, I guess, with the election. And then we had the latest Four Corners series kind of unpacking the way information was sent. Has this enabled other people to use this as a way of wanting to change truth? Like how is this sort of within your research? Do you how could this take place? Like, with somebody from that level in governance can do that and sort of not be held to accountable for sort of for what he's put out there in the media space during that period of time, and probably still continues to do that.
Look, there's some great questions and ideas in there, and I think if I were to do justice to all of them, we'd be here all day.
That's true.
So I'll at least make a start by saying, as I've often have, that Donald Trump was the perfect president for the disinformation era. The perfect president. You've mentioned elections. In fact, there were two. The one that started his career and the one in which...
Oh, that's right. Yes.
He lost, despite many protests to the contrary. In both, he operationalized disinformation to his own benefit, spreading rumors about certain social groups, about his political opponents, without apparently any second thought or with any shame. And I think what this comes back to, Ricky, is this construction, Trump's performance of a politician who is unlike other politicians. He's this performance of someone who, despite notorious wealth and privilege throughout his life, can also perform the role of being one of the people, the voice of the marginalized, the one who knows how the little guy and the little girl are suffering at the hands of the elites. He's a businessman. He's been around for many decades. He knew exactly what he was doing. One thing that particularly fascinated me about Trump was how he would attempt to close down arguments by calling something and tarnish his opponents, be they real or imagined. There was a bit of both there, with accusations of fake news. It's fake news. Fake news, hell, it's tweetable. It grabs attention.
Yeah.
It doesn't require a great deal of critical thought. In terms of Trump getting away with this, well, I don't know quite where to start there. He was eventually removed from Twitter and Facebook. And there's been a lot of, I think, quite thought-provoking discussion as to whether, well, was that too little, too late? Yeah.
And that's what I was going to ask you too. And I was thinking, the idea of fake news, is this something as a result that Trump had developed himself, that idea, or was this something that had existed prior to Trump, but he kind of used it, morphed it into his own political agenda?
All right. So Donald Trump didn't coin the term fake news. He didn't invent it. What he certainly did was popularize, e.g., via his social media platforms, in particular Twitter. And it's certainly a phrase that's handmade for the Twitter era. It sort of rolls off the tongue. It's a lot more casual than something like disinformation. Um, what fascinates and I suppose disturbs me about the term fake news is, well, what does it mean? It can mean
Yes.
something or nothing. It can refer to disinformation. It can refer to misinformation. It can refer to views that don't align with one's own. And it was in that latter usage that Trump was particularly prolific. What is fake news? We know it's a bad thing.
Going on from that, how does disinformation start? Is it something that people get together and think, right, we're going to send this and this, and for an, like, what is the purpose of disinformation?
Well, as I remarked earlier, the chief aim of material classified as disinformation is to harm, is to do injustice against a group, an ideology, a way of life, so on and so forth. It's a key example, like I've said, I put it, of digital hostility. If we're still riffing on Trump here, we might think back to the 2016 election and to the rumours that Hillary Clinton was aligned with a gang of pedophiles who had their headquarters under a pizza restaurant. Now, that was very clear. We might giggle about it, and of course, the Gothic excesses of QAnon. But really, that was out to besmirch Hillary, to reinforce a sense that was already there amongst sections of the population that she was elitist, that she was out of touch, and that she was up to no good. Why not ramp this up to the nth degree?
And
Not that she's just elitist and no good, but she's head of a crime ring.
And what happens when somebody uses disinformation? What impact does that have on the person that's the receiving end of that, in terms of their own character? Because in some ways, and I'm as a novice here, it kind of leaves that stain of doubt in some people's heads. Well, where there's smoke, there's fire. Or
yes. And that stain of doubt, as you so eloquently put it, will always be there thanks to the internet. Once something's online, it's there on the public record, broadly defined, forever and ever. I want to talk about the negative impacts, because after all, what is disinformation if not material that aims to cause harm? It can subvert people's decisions about what they do in their everyday life, important decisions, from who to vote for to how to best look after one's health and well-being, particularly salient during a pandemic era. I believe we are now in the 20th month.
Yes.
So that's the first thing that it can do. It can have a hugely negative impact on health and well-being. A great deal of my research has been looking at COVID conspiracies and COVID denialism, two strands which often come together, though not always. We've seen reports of people taking the substance ivermectin, and of course all the parlous health consequences that have. It can lead to death. Let me not understate this. So there are a few of the harms. It can lead to public acts of violence. A little earlier, I mentioned QAnon, the QAnon conspiracy, based around the idea that Donald Trump is in a secret battle against a cabal of pedophilic, vampiric elites who live in the sewers. It sounds like a Christopher Lee
Yeah, I
adaptation
was
of
going to
Teenage
say,
Mutant Ninja Turtles.
wow.
Now, we might find that ridiculous, but that has led to acts of public violence. It has led to people pursuing in their cars individuals they believe to be pedophiles. It's led to a skewed idea of, well, what is. It's endorsed a skewed idea of, well, what is a pedophile? What is a child sexual offender? Um, it's led to the anti-lockdown disinformation has led to quite violent protests around Australia, one in which a horse was menaced by a participant. It exceeds the bounds of what we understand communication to be. It is a genuine threat to our public health and safety and to the health and future of democracy everywhere.
And with your research, Dr. Thompson, how do you unpack it? Like when you're looking at examining, do you look at the authoritative, like how does one begin researching in this space? Because what is it that influences people to follow someone and spread this disinformation? Like, was this person a doctor? Was this person um, an actor of some prominence? How does this begin? Like, yeah, that sort of fascinates me as well.
There are a few questions baked in there. I'll try and address them. So my current research project poses the question, how can online communication about disinformation be cultivated in such ways as to encourage freedom
Yeah,
of speech while also mitigating harm
yeah,
towards media professionals and media consumers? That is all of us. Everyone watching this video, you are a media consumer. I dare say there'll be a few memes of me going like this, which I'm quite comfortable with. So, and I'm particularly fascinated in the role that online community managers and journalists play in cultivating this ethical communication. Of course, journalists do it by reporting on disinformation, by interviewing proponents and critics of disinformation, of educating the public. Online community managers do this through deciding who can and who cannot participate in their online communities, whatever these communities might be. They do this by, sorry, I'm just thinking. Well, they do it by, deciding what content is and isn't acceptable for their online community. So there's been a great deal of research on both groups and how both groups deal with or respond to remain resilient in the face of hostility. For instance, there's some wonderful work by scholars such as Sarah Roberts, Tarleton Gillespie, Jennifer Beckett on content moderators and the crucial role they play and how they remain resilient in the face of sometimes really violent material posted in the online spaces they manage. Not a great deal of scholarship as yet on how both groups can respond to disinformation while at the same time encouraging a vibrant exchange of ideas. You don't want to throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, if you see where I'm going there,
yeah,
in
absolutely.
trying to stamp out sometimes highly toxic speech. Do you, where is it, how do you do so in such a way as that doesn't shut other voices down, for instance, that doesn't encourage a robust debate? Where is that point?
And how
Do you
does
think?
and how does this, like with the COVID sort of
Mm,
conspiracies,
yeah.
does it have a life force of its own? Like what happens? Does it morph into something else? Like as more and more people become vaccinated
Yeah.
in the country, does it then morph into some other aspect of a conspiracy in relation to this, or does it die a death and then move on to some other issue?
Well, in terms of anti-vaccination rhetoric, I would want to remind your listeners and viewers that this is not new, that it has in fact existed as long as vaccines themselves. What I would say, echoing a whole range of other scholars, is that in the last 12 months, with all the tumultuousness, the uncertainty, that key word again, unprecedented, has created a climate of fear which has proved to be fertile ground for the anti-vaccination rhetoric and rhetoricians to sow their seeds of doubt in the minds of the public, to allege that, for instance, vaccinations are a crucial role in the so-called New World Order, or that they cause untold damage. So they're not new. As to the future of this rhetoric, optimistic though I am, I would strongly suspect it's not going to die out a death anytime soon, e.g. when 90% of the
Okay.
population is vaccinated. It doesn't work like that. What I hope is that media professionals and consumers can be assisted in developing better way, in being best equipped to respond to this disinformation in its various forms, and to identify the disinformation, and also in other words, sort out the wheat from the chaff, what's real and what's not.
And with this area of research, because I'm so fascinated by it, has the fact that a lot of us spaces were in lockdown, does that sort of precipitate it more because we are sort of enclosed in our own little homes and we're kind of reliant through the world of digital, the digital highway to kind of tell us what's happening, that some people become, I guess, obsessed, or if, as you're saying, they belong to certain groups and this becomes their main world? How does lockdown have an impact on these sorts of disinformation? And
My thesis is a very firm yes to those
okay,
questions. I think now more than ever, the boundaries between real life, the real world, and the
yeah.
online world have blurred immeasurably. This is the environment in which we're talking, in which your viewers will be consuming our conversation,
Yeah.
is the real world. So we've got that, an increased reliance, an increased exposure to all kinds of information, including information that may be regarded as disinformation. I think we also need to look at the structure of social media platforms, that they do diminish nuance. They're not conducive to nuance. There's only so much nuance you can have in
Yeah.
a tweet
Yes.
or a Facebook post. There's
Wow.
only so much nuance. What research has found is that material that generates heightened emotions, e.g. anger, excitement, do tend to get shared, whether or not the person sharing it has even looked at it.
Mm-hmm.
I think also getting back to the question of COVID, to the question of lockdowns, and it returns to a point I said earlier, that we're living in a time of incredible global fear and uncertainty. People are doing it tough across the world, losing jobs, losing housing, losing health and well-being, relationships disintegrating. So I could speculate that one reason why, one of many, I should say, why disinformation, e.g. about vaccines or about the novel coronavirus, have been so potent and so influential, is that they do give people something to hold on to. The sense that you know the truth. You've mastered the truth. You've seen through the lies. And that you can play somehow an active role in combating those lies, supposed lies. When in fact, the disinformation itself is what's the lie. The idea that it's being used to control the population is the lie.
And with your research,
Mm.
is there a particular age group that are more likely to participate in dialogues and be um, taken
Mm.
as fueling this movement of disinformation?
As producing and or disseminating disinformation,
Yeah.
I mean. That's a fascinating question. It's not a question I have an answer to. I more look at the cultivation and the responses to this disinformation and why and how we can remain ethical. And by ethical, what I mean
Yeah.
there is treating others as fairly as possible and at least mitigating the chance of harm.
And can
But
I
also
maybe explore?
encouraging a range
Yeah.
of voices.
Can we maybe explore that a little bit? Like, why is ethical um, consideration important? I mean, just for our listeners, just so they can. Why are we talking about ethics when we're talking about this particular area of disinformation and digital hostility?
Great question. And put simply, I think ethics really are about how we best treat one another. Ethics, having ethical principles, adhering to those ethical principles, be it in the workplace, brick and mortar workplace, be it on Facebook or Twitter or Zoom, be it anywhere, how to mitigate harm so we can all live the best lives we can. We can all have a say. Of course, ethics are also deeply subjective.
Mm,
Some might, I mean, for instance, I would use the example, which is very topical on Twitter at the moment, of a certain ABC journalist who
mm,
has been accused of being critical of lockdowns
yes.
and it has been called unethical as a result of that. And I've seen calls for her to lose her job. I've seen calls for her to just pipe down and not have a voice in the public sphere. I tend to think controversially those responses might be more unethical than what she's actually doing. For the record, I frequently disagree
Mm,
with this individual. I would also say, well, how ethical is it for the consumer, who is also the producer, e.g., the producer of tweets, the producer of Facebook
yes.
updates,
Yeah.
YouTube videos, etc., to call for someone's employment to be terminated on the grounds that they've said something
Yeah.
contentious, but not necessarily harmful. How ethical is it to treat someone this way when it's unlikely a man would be treated, a male journalist would be treated quite the same?
Yes, it does raise a lot of
And yet, a lot of people would
issues.
say that that is ethical. So it's how do we as a society, how do we as media consumers come to a consensus? How do, what does treating someone fairly look like?
Yeah. And this just raises again this issue that because of Twitter being
Mm.
so accessible in terms of anyone can put anything out
Yeah.
without that censorship, obviously there are some key words that
Mm.
Twitter will take down
Yeah.
if one uses it. But on the other hand, and I do remember, and I can't remember where forum that you spoke at,
Mm.
but you mentioned something about this notion that prior to Twitter, everything was print or in some spaces moderated more or controlled all the mechanisms, whereas now, how does we're allowing Twitter within itself, and you're mentioning moderators
Mm.
of groups to
Yeah.
manage. Do you see Twitter evolving at all with what's happening with COVID? Could you see a time where Twitter becomes more compliant, if I could use the word, or changing to what information you will be allowed to tweet?
That's a great question. It's a very speculative question in some ways. I'm not sure which of the earlier statements you're referring to. I think by way of responding
Or
to your question.
I'm thinking like with
Mm.
COVID-19, say with the
Yeah,
disinformation
yeah.
that's going around. do they have a ethical responsibility to somehow moderate that, or put a statement to say this is not supported, or this is not based on fact?
Yes. Well, the answer is absolutely. And I think that no one would know this more than, for example, those working in content moderation roles with the whole gamut of social media platforms, and they include Twitter. In putting in my research at the moment, one of the things I've noticed is, one of the things I'm sort of thinking about is the immense pressure that the pandemic has put on these moderators to manage this tsunami of, misinformation, disinformation, half accurate information, and whatnot, in a way that avoids doing damage, but that also in a way avoids shutting down conversations on certain topics. I'll just use the following example, and this is
Yes.
not an example that's been proposed for reasons that will become understandable, but it's the example of, well, imagine if everything that was posted on Twitter or Instagram about COVID-19 was blocked, for example, or removed. For example, if it didn't, or I mean, A, how would that be policed? And B, well, doesn't this contravene another ethical principle, which is, of course, the principle of free speech, or I like to refer to as cultivating inclusive, broad-ranging speech? Is that even possible, for example? Another example, in the health and wellness communities, we've seen many examples, I'm not going to get specific to promote them, of material that it could be GIFs, it could be, images, it could be memes that appear to be very tranquil and inoffensive, with lines like "do your own research," that at first glance or at first blush, as the case might be, seem eminently reasonable until you know what these are code for, until you know that they're frequently endorsing disinformation in one of its many guises. That is a huge concern. And I suppose the question that I have as a researcher is, well, where do we draw the line? Is it taking down something that uses the term do your own research, for example? Is that what we do? It's a fine balancing act, regulating disinformation while encouraging broad-ranging public debates. And that can involve hearing views that one may disagree with. What kind of world do we want to live in?
And
I don't have the answer, by the way.
But it's a good one to pose to everyone listening.
Yes.
And my other thing is, with your research, looking at moderators, there's a lot of pressure on people who are moderators to kind of filter that information. How do you research moderators in your research? Do you pull out a request to ask moderators to contact you, or do you reach out to people of certain tweeters and to come and speak to you? How does that work in terms of your research?
So I'm embarking on a research project where I aim to undertake interviews and ethnographic work with those working in online community management and content moderation roles. I'm also highly familiar with the vast scholarship about content moderation. Really, in the last 10 years, we've seen this come about. Tarleton Gillespie refers to those undertaking content moderation tasks. It could be designated moderators. It could be community managers who do it as part of a portfolio of workplace tasks. He refers to them as custodians of the internet. And I love that phrase.
Yeah, I love that too.
Internet, because the internet, websites, in all their diversity and scope, cannot operate without these people.
Wow.
They cannot. They are absolutely indispensable. And there has been, there is a growing corpus of scholarship. And I'm thinking here of the Gillespie book, I'm thinking of Jennifer Beckett's work that looks at the often toxic material that content moderators and online community managers must face on a day-to-day basis, and how to remain resilient in the face of this. And these are huge questions. They're huge workplace questions. They're huge emotional questions too. What hasn't been is some of the research I've just talked about looks at, for example, highly toxic, it could be misogynist or homophobic or racist material that's published, e.g. in below the line sections or in emails to the moderators. I think a more fascinating question, and one that I want to explore in this project I'm undertaking, and that builds very much on my earlier research, is, well, how does one remain resilient in the face of disinformation? How do you sort out the wheat from the chaff, for example? Onto the topic of journalists. Well, what are the factors, institutional, legal, and so forth, that guide a journalist's decision whether or not to interview somebody who propounds disinformation? What are the risks and what are the potential benefits? And that's a really, that's a huge ethical quagmire.
And with your research that you're embarking on exploring this, are you focusing it on one particular geographical area, or are you looking at through a global lens?
All right, so the research project that I'm embarking on will focus primarily on Australia. I think Australia is a fascinating context for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
I do hope, though, that it will have important implications for similar research that's being undertaken around the world. I also hope to build collaborations with researchers in overseas universities who are examining precisely these topics. I think there's some rich ground for transatlantic scholarship on these topics and cross-cultural scholarship.
How long do you envisage this project to take?
Well, I'm currently working on it as part of the DECRA application. Of course, for your listeners, DECRA is the Discovery Early Career Researcher Award. So it's a 3-year time frame. It is a highly competitive award. But it is one that I entirely believe in for this project. So the grant itself, were I to be successful, would run for 3 years, but I'm also thinking in the longer term. After all, just as disinformation is not new, nor is it going to somehow peter out when the pandemic becomes history.
And can we now put a little bit more on digital hostility?
Yes.
Because that to me is fascinating.
Yes. All right, so digital hostility takes quite a number of forms. It can take the form of doxing, releasing personal information about an individual, e.g. their home address, their family members' names and so forth, their bank details and so forth in public fora. It can take the form of cyber stalking, cyber bullying. It can take the form of highly vicious and personalised commentary in below the line sections, e.g. of newspapers and on social media. It can take the form of threats. The other thing I want to say about digital hostility is how subjective it is. And a question that energises me at the moment, and I don't quite have an answer to it, is, well, where do we draw the line between digital hostility and robust, but not necessarily toxic debate? Do you see where I'm going there?
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, obviously things like doxing, like death threats, threats of sexual violence, and so forth, are clearly digital hostility. They're clearly beyond the pale. They're clearly unacceptable, unethical, and entirely antithetical to any known understanding of democracy or public health and safety. The bigger question I have is, well, does disagreeing with someone passionately, be that on Twitter, be that via email, be that in a YouTube video that you've recorded yourself, but not not personalizing it, not making threats of violence, is that hostility? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
And look, these are questions I would wager that journalists, online community managers face every day. It's a question that I face when I use social media, e.g., if I disagree with somebody, no matter how respectfully, could it be construed as hostile, either because of language I may or may not use? And I'm not talking about insults or threats here. It could be the person doesn't know me personally, doesn't know how I express myself. It could be, lack of context, for example. To use the example, we're here talking, you can hear my tone of voice. You can see my body language, which I hope isn't too jittery. All of those factors, important factors, are missing in the online environment.
So it's so fascinating,
Yeah.
Dr. Jay. We could really go on forever, and I'm hoping in the next podcast we do explore it even further, because to me it's such an important area, because it taps into so many areas of bullying, what one perceives as bullying, what one perceives as, damaging of one's character, and I guess that intersects with laws of libel. And I don't have time to even ask you, but one of my things I was fascinated with is the notion of having lists of registered, this is a probably controversial one, registered sex offenders. I think Western Australia or someone was proposing that people in the community could access. And I kept thinking of that when you were speaking about releasing of numbers and details of where people live if they've committed a certain crime. That's seen, and what impact that has, because on the one level, if a government legislates it as it's okay, like it's given the law that allows for this to take place, and that information is available on a platform, does the person who has served the crime, in a custodial sentence, but therefore is labelled that as an offender of a sexual nature, they are now then always typecasted, and because of they would see that as hostility, because it's giving it. So it's such a complex area, and yet fascinating. So I look forward to our next session. Just before we go, Doctor,
if I'm allowed to throw in
please
another
do.
Harm or potentially harmful outcome of digital hostility, particularly the more overt kinds that we've been talking about, which are very clearly labelled unacceptable and unambiguously wrong, is the chilling impact that can have on others, be that journalists, be that media professionals, be that everyday internet users. Why would you want to express what your views on a particular platform if you know you're going to get threats of violence? Why would you even choose to have an account? Would you want to check your emails if you know that there might be abusive content in there? And I think if the last 20 months have shown us anything, it's that, like I said earlier, the division between the sort of brick and mortar world, the so-called real world, and the online world has become increasingly opaque. This is the real world.
So fascinating as always. Thank you so much, Dr. Jay Daniel Thompson. And if we'll put a link to of your research and your work that people can, and of course your Twitter handle, so people can comment and suggestions and ideas. I'm sure that you welcome that for people to give your views on. If you're a content moderator, perhaps reach out to yourself and maybe talk about some of the dilemmas that they're
Okay.
faced in disclosure. So again, everyone, thank you for listening, and we'll have Dr. Jay Thompson on very shortly again. Thank you.
Thank you so